There are moments in history when a silence is broken and the sound echoes far beyond a single courtroom or a single nation. Imagine this. A man who has spent his entire life delivering verdicts, cloaked in the authority of law, suddenly stands before the world not to pass judgment, but to confess. Not to condemn another, but to condemn himself. That was the shock that rippled across headlines when Clarence Thomas, one of America's most powerful legal figures, looked into the cameras and admitted he had been wrong, deeply wrong, in his judgment of Burkina Faso and its young leader, Ibrahim Traoré. For older Americans watching, this was not just a legal story. It was a moral one. A reminder that even the highest courts, the oldest institutions, can stumble when they allow fear and politics to replace truth. For the people of Burkina Faso, it was something even greater, vindication. A validation that their struggle for sovereignty was not reckless or misguided, but just. To understand why this confession matters, we need to look back. Burkina Faso is not a country that usually commands headlines in New York or Washington. Landlocked, battered by drought, its name is too often tied to famine or conflict. Yet, in the past 2 years, its story has become impossible to ignore. At the center of it all stands Ibrahim Traoré, a man barely in his mid-30s, yet already shaping the destiny of an entire region. When the lawsuit landed, a $500 million legal action backed by American law, the message seemed clear. Traoré was reckless, unstable, a threat to order. News anchors spoke of financial misconduct, of shady deals, of a nation too small to defy international systems. The world was told that this was about protecting law, about upholding justice. But as the months dragged on, another picture began to emerge. A picture not of reckless leadership, but of a deliberate effort to weaken a young nation, daring to stand on its own feet. And then came the twist. Not from Burkina Faso, not from Africa, but from inside the very heart of American authority. Clarence Thomas himself, the man who could have remained silent, chose instead to speak. He admitted that he had been manipulated, that the lawsuit was not about justice at all, but about fear. Fear of an Africa that refuses to bow. So here's the question we must ask. What does it mean when even the guardians of American law admit their mistakes? What does it mean for a continent long treated as a pawn to hear one of the world's most powerful judges say, "I was wrong"? And most importantly, where does this leave Ibrahim Traoré and Burkina Faso as they fight to define their own future? This is not just a courtroom drama. This is the story of a continent's awakening, and tonight, we take you inside it. When the lawsuit first broke into the headlines, many in the international community barely blinked. A $500 million case against a small West African country sounded technical, almost routine. Lawsuits, after all, are not uncommon in the global marketplace. But this one was different. It carried the weight of American authority. It bore the stamp of institutions that for decades have shaped international order. And it targeted a man, President Ibrahim Traoré, whose very presence had already unsettled the old balance of power in Africa. The lawsuit alleged financial misconduct, reckless partnerships, and destabilizing moves that could threaten international stability. The numbers were staggering: $500 million, a sum equal to nearly 1/3 of Burkina Faso's entire national budget. The charge was simple but devastating. Traoré was risking his people's future, and the world needed to intervene. For many outside observers, it seemed believable. After all, Burkina Faso had long been painted as a fragile state, reliant on aid, vulnerable to conflict. But inside the country, the perception was starkly different. Ordinary citizens saw the lawsuit not as justice, but as intimidation. They remembered decades of outside interference, contracts signed that drained their gold, aid that came with strings attached, and security partnerships that left them dependent. To them, this lawsuit looked like just another tool to keep their nation in line. The tension was not abstract. It was deeply personal. Take the story of Mariam, a teacher in Ouagadougou. She had spent years trying to provide stable education for her students, despite rolling blackouts, scarce resources, and overcrowded classrooms. When she heard the lawsuit announced on the radio, her first thought was not about legal details, but about whether her school's funding would be cut, whether the new textbooks promised by the government would ever arrive. For Mariam, the case meant one thing: uncertainty for her children's future. Inside Traoré's government, the pressure was immense. Diplomats whispered that international partners were pulling away. Some local businesses worried about frozen contracts. The opposition quietly suggested that Burkina Faso should compromise, settle quickly, accept conditions, and avoid provoking further anger from Washington. But Traore refused. At just 35 years old, he carried himself not as a man on trial, but as a leader determined to prove that his country's sovereignty was not for sale. This refusal to bend was both inspiring and risky. For months, international media amplified the narrative of recklessness. News anchors in New York and Paris described Traoré as dangerously defiant. Analysts warned of isolation, economic collapse, even political instability. And yet, on the streets of Ouagadougou, the chants grew louder. Our land, our rights, our future. Ordinary people rallied around their young president, not because they dismissed the risks, but because they recognized the pattern. They had seen this playbook before, accusations dressed as law, designed to weaken nations that dared to assert independence. Behind the scenes, the machinery of pressure was grinding forward. Financial reports circulated in Washington, each framed with urgency. Burkina Faso destabilizing international partnerships. Burkina Faso risking regional security. The more urgent the tone, the less room there was for honest debate. In the corridors of power, urgency often substitutes for truth. And that urgency pushed the lawsuit forward, piling weight onto a leader already battling drought, conflict, and poverty. And then came the unexpected turn. Clarence Thomas, a man whose authority rested on decades of judgments, looked at the case and admitted he had been wrong. He confessed that the lawsuit had been shaped not by pure justice, but by fear. Fear of an Africa that stands tall, fear of a leader who refuses to bow, fear of a continent learning to say no. His words stunned even seasoned observers. In Washington, legal scholars debated whether such an admission undermined credibility. In Africa, the reaction was different. It was vindication. Crowds poured into the streets, not to celebrate the downfall of an American judge, but to celebrate their leader's resilience. For the first time in years, people felt that truth had pierced through the fog of power. But let's pause here, because the significance of this moment was not just in the apology. It was in what it revealed. The lawsuit was never just about contracts or finance. It was about the very principle of sovereignty. Could a small African nation decide its own path, or would it be punished whenever it strayed too far from expectations? For citizens like Mariam, for farmers in the Sahel, for young people marching with Traoré's portrait in their hands, the answer was clear. The case was not about legality, it was about dignity. And when the apology came, it confirmed what they had believed all along, that the lawsuit was less a safeguard of justice and more a weapon of fear. But apologies, no matter how dramatic, do not erase consequences. The pressure, the uncertainty, the months of doubt, these cannot be undone with a single statement. Which raises the next question. If apologies cannot heal everything, then what happens now? The turning point came not in a courtroom, nor in the offices of diplomats, but in a televised statement that no one expected. Clarence Thomas, a man known for his silence more than his words, stepped forward with an admission that shook both Washington and Ouagadougou. His voice, steady but heavy, carried a weight that echoed across continents. I was wrong, deeply wrong, and I apologize. For the people of Burkina Faso, those words were not just about a lawsuit. They were about decades of humiliation. They were about generations who had seen their country treated as a pawn in games played far away. To hear an American justice admit manipulation, to hear him confess that fear and politics had dressed themselves up as law, this was more than a personal apology. It was a moment of reckoning. The climax unfolded like a drama in 3 acts. Act 1, the confession. In Washington, cameras captured a rare sight, a man of towering legal authority lowering his head. Clarence Thomas admitted he had been used. He acknowledged that the lawsuit was never truly about protecting order, but about containing the rise of a nation that refused to bend. His words painted a vivid picture of how urgent memos, whispered warnings, and carefully framed arguments had tilted the scales of justice. For once, the mask slipped. And in that slip, the world glimpsed the machinery of pressure that small nations face every day. Act 2, the people's response. Back in Burkina Faso, the streets erupted. In Ouagadougou's Revolution Square, thousands gathered. Drums pounded, flags waved, chants rose into the night. Our land, our rights, our future, they shouted, this time not as a plea, but as a declaration. For young people who had felt invisible on the world stage, the moment was electrifying. Students shared clips of the confession across WhatsApp and Telegram. Farmers in rural provinces watched replays on community televisions powered by generators. The reaction was not gloating. It was affirmation. They had been right to believe in their leader, right to resist, right to trust their own story over narratives written abroad. Among them was Sarah, a textile worker who had feared losing her job when the lawsuit first broke. Her factory produced clothing for export, and rumors spread that contracts might collapse. For months, she had gone to work each day with a pit in her stomach, wondering if this would be her last paycheck. But when she heard Thomas's words, she told her colleagues, "He admitted it. They cannot say we are liars anymore. We were not reckless. We were strong." Her story captured what the lawsuit had meant at the human level: anxiety, fear, and now, relief. Act 3. The international shockwaves outside Africa, reactions were mixed. In Europe, some media outlets downplayed the apology, calling it political theater. In Washington, officials scrambled to contain the fallout, insisting that Thomas's statement was personal and not reflective of U.S. policy. Yet the unease was clear. For allies accustomed to seeing Africa as dependent, the idea that an American judge could openly admit manipulation raised uncomfortable questions. If this lawsuit was flawed, how many others had been? Meanwhile, across Africa, the confession ignited a sense of unity. Leaders in Mali, Niger, and Guinea praised Traore's resilience. Commentators in Johannesburg and Lagos called the apology a crack in the wall of arrogance. On social media, hashtags like "Our Africa Will Not Bow" and "Justice for Burkina" surged. Suddenly, Burkina Faso's struggle was no longer seen as isolated. It was part of a larger narrative: Africa standing up to power. This was the climax, not just a statement, but a symbolic reversal. A small nation once accused of recklessness now stood validated. A leader once painted as unstable now looked steadfast. And a continent too often silenced now found its voice amplified. But as powerful as the moment was, it also raised new challenges. Would this apology change the systems that allowed such lawsuits in the first place? Would it deter future attempts to pressure nations through legal or economic means? Or would it fade, remembered only as a dramatic confession that left deeper structures untouched? For Traore, the stakes remained high. The celebration in the streets was real, but so were the difficulties ahead: food shortages, security threats, and the constant struggle against drought. A single apology could not fill empty stomachs or secure borders. Yet the symbolic power mattered. It shifted perception. It turned doubt into determination. The imagery of that night in Ouagadougou, crowds chanting, candles held high, young people waving flags, will linger in history books. Because for once, it was not just a protest against injustice. It was a celebration of vindication. And still, the question remains: can one apology spark lasting change? Or is it simply a moment of relief before the machinery of pressure starts turning again? The apology may have ended the lawsuit, but it did not end the struggle. In fact, for Burkina Faso, it opened a new chapter, one filled with opportunity, but also with responsibility. Inside the country, the effects were immediate. For months, uncertainty had clouded daily life. Farmers wondered if international contracts for their harvests would collapse. Factory workers like Sarah feared layoffs. Students questioned whether their government could secure scholarships and programs promised before the lawsuit. When Clarence Thomas admitted he had been wrong, that cloud lifted. Hope surged. Suddenly, the people of Burkina Faso were not the accused. They were the vindicated. Politically, this changed the atmosphere in Ouagadougou. President Ibrahim Traoré's image, once under fire from international critics, now glowed with renewed legitimacy. His refusal to bow to outside pressure was validated by the very institution that had tried to weaken him. Even opposition figures who had quietly urged compromise now struggled to argue against him. Parliamentarians who once hesitated to support his reforms began aligning themselves more openly. The civil impact was equally visible. Community gatherings, once filled with worry, turned into discussions of resilience. In villages across the Sahel, elders told young people that this was proof. The world could no longer dismiss them so easily. Teachers like Mariam used the story as a lesson in her classroom. "This is what sovereignty means," she told her students. "It means deciding for yourself, even when others try to stop you." But the story did not stay within Burkina Faso's borders. The ripple spread across the Sahel, a region already reshaping itself after years of foreign military presence. Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso had recently strengthened their cooperation through what many call the Sahel Alliance. The apology reinforced their narrative that Africa was capable of defending itself, governing itself, and standing on equal footing with global powers. Leaders across these nations pointed to Traoré's perseverance as an example. If Burkina can stand, so can we, declared a minister in Niamey. For ordinary Africans beyond the Sahel, the impact was deeply emotional. In Dakar, students marched with signs reading, "Africa is not a pawn." In Johannesburg, radio programs debated whether this was the start of a continental shift in how Africa interacts with the West. In Lagos, young entrepreneurs spoke of new confidence, saying if Burkina Faso could resist pressure, perhaps they too could demand fairer trade terms. Yet not all impacts were celebratory. In Washington and European capitals, the apology created unease. Policymakers worried it could embolden African leaders to resist international frameworks. Some analysts warned of a dangerous precedent, the idea that small nations could refuse compliance and emerge stronger. Investment groups hesitated, questioning whether contracts in Africa might now be seen as more politically vulnerable. For Traoré, this was both a victory and a new battlefield. Domestically, the government faced the challenge of translating symbolic triumph into material progress. Citizens wanted more than pride. They wanted jobs, stability, and food security. The lawsuit had delayed key projects, and now expectations were higher than ever. In towns across the country, people asked, if we won against Washington, can we now win against hunger? The political calculus also shifted. Traoré's critics abroad labeled him defiant. At home, his popularity soared. But popularity is fragile if unmet promises pile up. Civil society groups urged the government to focus on tangible reforms, improving irrigation systems, investing in education, and securing safer borders. The symbolic battle was won, but the practical war remained. Still, one could not ignore the larger symbolism. For decades, African leaders had been accused of silence, of bowing to external dictates. This moment showed something different. It showed a young leader refusing compromise and a nation rallying behind him. And when the apology came, it was not just about one man's vindication. It was about an entire continent's voice being heard. Perhaps the most profound impact lay in psychology. For years, Africans had internalized the narrative that their nations were fragile, their leaders corrupt, their futures bound by dependency. The apology cracked that narrative. It suggested that even the strongest global institutions could be forced to admit error. It reminded citizens that their struggle for dignity was not hopeless. And yet, questions remain. Can Burkina Faso build lasting prosperity on this momentum? Can symbolic victories translate into better harvests, stronger schools, and reliable healthcare? Can unity across Africa withstand the pressures of geopolitics, aid dependency, and internal divisions? The answer is uncertain. But one thing is clear. The lawsuit that was meant to weaken Traoré ended up strengthening him. The apology that was meant to close a chapter instead opened a new one. And in villages and cities across Burkina Faso, the people are asking themselves a question they have not asked in generations. If we can win this, what else can we achieve? In Washington, the apology landed like a thunderclap. For decades, American institutions projected strength, certainty, and the image of impartial justice. Now, one of their own had admitted on record that even the law could be bent by fear and politics. Officials moved quickly to contain the damage. Press statements insisted Clarence Thomas had spoken in a personal capacity. Analysts filled television panels to argue that his words did not represent U.S. policy, but the unease was visible. If one lawsuit could be exposed as a tool of intimidation, what did that say about America's credibility elsewhere? Across Europe, reactions were mixed. Some commentators praised the honesty, calling it a rare act of humility. Others dismissed it as political theater, a distraction from deeper structural imbalances. Governments that had long aligned with Washington worried the admission would embolden African leaders to reject international agreements, especially in resource-rich regions. Meanwhile, in Africa, the global lens looked entirely different. Commentators hailed the moment as proof that persistence could bend even the strongest powers. In Addis Ababa, African Union officials quietly discussed using the case as precedent to challenge other unequal arrangements. In Lagos and Nairobi, newspapers ran editorials titled "Africa Will Not Bow" and "The End of Silent Compliance." For the United States, the stakes extended far beyond one lawsuit. The Sahel is a key security frontier. Counter-terrorism operations, alliances, and trade routes all pass through this fragile region. If nations like Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger grow more united and assertive, U.S. influence could wane. And if Washington is seen not as a partner but as a manipulator, cooperation becomes harder to maintain. This is the cliffhanger facing the world. Will the international community adapt to Africa's rising sovereignty, treating it as an equal player? Or will it double down, seeking new ways to contain a continent no longer willing to bend? Because in the eyes of millions across Africa, the meaning of the apology was simple. Even the mightiest can be challenged. Even the narratives of power can be rewritten. And for the first time in a long time, the story is being told not about Africa, but by Africa. In the end, an apology does not rebuild a school, it does not irrigate a field, and it does not fill an empty stomach. But it does something that can be just as powerful. It changes perception. And perception, in politics as in life, can alter the course of history. For Burkina Faso, Clarence Thomas's confession was more than a legal footnote. It was proof that their struggle was seen, that their dignity was acknowledged, and that their young leader's defiance had not been in vain. For Africa, it was a rare crack in the wall of global arrogance, a reminder that even the strongest systems are not immune to accountability. Yet, this moment carries both hope and warning. Hope, because it shows that persistence and courage can pierce the armor of power. Warning, because the forces that sought to silence Burkina Faso have not disappeared. Lawsuits may be withdrawn, but economic pressures, security tensions, and political isolation can return in new forms. The struggle for sovereignty is never won in a single battle. Looking ahead, the real test is whether Burkina Faso can turn this symbolic victory into tangible progress. Over the next 3 to 6 months, the government faces critical decisions, launching stalled infrastructure projects, reinforcing food security before the next planting season, and strengthening ties with neighboring states. If they succeed, the apology will be remembered as the spark that ignited a new era. If they fail, it risks fading into memory, a dramatic moment that changed little. For the United States and the wider world, the foresight is equally pressing. Africa is not a passive player waiting for handouts. It is a continent of rising voices, determined to write its own story. The question is whether global powers will learn to engage as partners, or whether they will continue to view Africa's independence as a threat. So, we end with this reflection. What if the next time a young leader says no, the world listens instead of retaliates? What if sovereignty is not punished, but respected? And what if, in the deserts of Burkina Faso, a generation grows up believing that their future is theirs to decide? The story of Ibrahim Traoré and Burkina Faso is not finished. It is only beginning.